Europe will have to face up to its own responsibilities with its security, with its budget for NATO, and with defending Ukraine.
Anthony, you have a piece in the Times about how Ukraine is doing in the war, and I have to say it's to an extent disappointingly downbeat. You say that Ukraine cannot win without a bigger army. I guess in a way that's an echo of what Zelensky has been desperately flying around the world trying to tell people.
Mariella, hello. In some ways, that's an echo, but in some ways not. Zelensky has been, he's slightly blanched on the opportunity so far to mobilize the forces he needs. The mobilization bill, which is being hotly debated at the moment inside Ukraine, is not something he's really pushed for. It's, hugely controversial political act to, for example, lower the recruiting of the mobilizing age down from 27, which is what it's at the moment, down to 18. And without that, without the few 100,000, perhaps as many as 500,000 more soldiers, the troops already in the front line are getting exhausted. They're getting depleted by huge casualties. Listeners should be in no doubt. Out in the east, it is carnage, carnage.
Yeah, no, I mean,
And
go
and
ahead.
they're just not gonna. You're not going to be able to keep those experienced units in the front indefinitely for those reasons, heavy casualties, and because men become exhausted. You've got to rotate them out. You've got to refit and replenish them and replace them with other guys, which is why this mobilization issue is such a big issue.
But I suppose domestically, that's quite a problem, I think, highlighted in a way by Matthew Parris, who wrote a column having visited Kyiv, wrote a column in the Times, talking about how young people feel, abject terror about the idea of being called up. And if it goes from 27 down to 18, I mean, you're going to have parents in revolt as well. I mean, it changes the dynamic, doesn't it? It changes the level of domestic support for the war to an
It,
extent.
it's a very complicated issue because, on the one hand, if you want what they call Sturm units, assault groups, to go in and take out Russian trenches, and this is a war primarily about territory. Ukraine has had successes at sea, but those successes at sea will be negated unless they can match them with successes on land. You want these guys in the Storm units to be between the ages of 20 and 25, basically. Fit, aggressive, virile young men, heavily armed. You don't want them, which is what they are at the moment, 43 plus, because you get very tired very quickly at that age. But the other thing is that Ukraine has to redress its issues with training. Part of the problem at the moment is that Ukrainian society, by and large, supports its defensive war against Russian aggression. But many elements of society feels that the training given to its soldiers is so poor, often only 5 or 6 weeks, and train almost as individuals or as very small units rather than in bigger units, that they go to the front not very confident in their abilities and are quickly killed. And so, on the one hand, you've got a society which supports the war, but doubts the ability of the government and military to be able to train its sons effectively enough to stay alive. And that is so you need more men and you need better training.
What about, the international community and the sort of sense of perhaps lessening interest? Are we guilty of expecting the Ukrainians to fight a war against Russia that actually we really need them to win for our sake, if that isn't too complicated a way of putting it?
Well, I think primarily if Ukrainians don't win a war against Russia, then they will be subjugated by Russia and they will have more to lose than anybody. However, it is expedient, I think is the right word, for NATO to want Ukraine to win because there is huge fear now, which is very different to 2 years ago, may I add, that Russia, if it does win in Ukraine, may then start looking at Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania as a future objective. Now, I'm not sure how accurate that fear is. You would have thought, given all the difficulties Russia has in securing comparatively small towns in eastern Ukraine, whether therefore naturally it would want to go and attack NATO members. But nevertheless, those fears are real. So it's beholden to Western interests at the moment to make sure Ukraine does win. But let's be very clear about this. Those with the greater stake in victory are Ukrainians, because if they don't win, there will be Russian tanks in Kyiv.
Just finally, I mean, in broader terms, membership of the EU and NATO, dangled but not achieved yet. Would that ensure a victory, or would that just ensure an escalation of the war that's already taking place?
Well, taking it a step back, what do both sides want in their own definition of victory? Both sides are maximalist. Russia wants Ukraine, he wants the Zelensky government overthrown and a government in Kyiv that's subjugated to Russia and in Russian sphere. Zelensky says he wants the maximalist aim of the return of all sovereign Ukraine to, Kyiv's grasp. It's unlikely that either will be fully achieved. But if Ukraine manages to hold on to most of its territory, it will probably have to lose some, which it will mourn. But if it manages to hold on to most of its territory and does get NATO membership, EU membership, it can count that as a pretty good victory. But if it doesn't, then that will undoubtedly be a defeat.
Sorry, very quickly, just finally, I mean, is there any hope of Ukraine winning if the US doesn't come up with this 60 billion package of support, which has been delayed in the House of Representatives?
Ukrainian victory is entirely dependent, or it's dependent on a number of things, and that won't necessarily guarantee a victory. But without Western, by which I mean American and European aid, Ukraine cannot win. However, further to that, Europe must also realize that, it's not, America will not go on funding NATO indefinitely as it did on structures which were defined just after the Second World War, when Europe was too eroded to look after itself against the Russians. And Europe will have to face up to its own responsibilities with its security, with its budget for NATO, and with defending Ukraine.
Anthony Loyd, thank you so much for joining me. That was Anthony Loyd, the Times special correspondent, the perfect guest to round up our week-long zoom in on Ukraine from 4 very different angles. Very grateful to him for joining me, and to all our guests earlier in the week as well.